Hello, welcome. Thank you all for joining us today for another webinar, part of the Meet the Experts series. Today, we are going to talk about the RDA COVID-19 recommendations for data sharing. Just a few logistics to get us started. We would like to let you know that the session is being recorded and that we will make the recording available online on the RDA website. Also, by default, you are in listen-only mode, but you do have the opportunity via the question and answer box in your GoToWebinar control panel to ask any questions you'd like throughout the webinar. We will have a section dedicated to that and a short discussion after the presentation, so you're welcome to share any questions with us. Without further ado, I'll pass on to Natalie. Please.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, if you're joining us in Ireland or whatever time of the day it is, wherever you may happen to be. We're very pleased to be doing this webinar. Timea and I have worked as part of this working group for a number of weeks, so it's nice to be able to share the results of what this global collaborative effort has brought together and to share it with those of you in Ireland who are interested in the work of the Research Data Alliance or in data sharing under our increasingly long pandemic of COVID-19. So both Timea and I, as I said, were involved in this working group, or it's still ongoing, but the main output is there. I was one of the co-chairs of the group and took over chairing the editorial team. And then Timea was a moderator on the one of the subgroups. So she had a very heavy job in writing one of the key aspects of the recommendations and guidelines. Okay. So just a bit of a background to what this whole thing is about. Very early when the pandemic was kind of hitting Europe, there was a request from the European Commission to the Research Data Alliance. Could you come up with a series of recommendations and guidelines around data sharing? And the Research Data Alliance, for those of you that don't know, is a global organization. The Digital Repository of Ireland and the National Library of Ireland are involved in the Irish node of helping to deliver the RDA, but it is a global organization and it is dedicated to trying to reduce the barriers between data sharing, both on the social and the technical side on all different kinds of topics. So the request made sense because this is part of what RDA does. So the way that it was set up is the working group was created from existing RDA members, but also new ones were kind of brought into the process that had expertise in these areas. And 4 different research areas were set up. And then also, as time went on, we realized that there were a number of what we called cross-cutting themes that needed to be addressed, but weren't particular to any one of the kind of scientific research areas that were being addressed separately. So we ended up with 8 different groups. And the whole process was structured through a series of different teams and meetings. As with many of us during the pandemic, it was kind of Zoom central for quite some time. There were chairs and moderators meetings. The groups met on different schedules themselves, which Timea will give an example of that later. There was an editorial team, visualization team. We had the Zotero Library. So we had all of these teams working across time zones that ranged from kind of the West Coast US through to Australia. So some people had to suffer terrible times. And this process went on really from the beginning of April till the end of June through continual sprints. So we held open consultation on 6 different draft releases of the guidelines and recommendations. We held weekly webinars to update people and to answer questions. And then finally, the final release was endorsed by RDA and published on the 30th of June. Now it's a document, it's quite hefty. Didn't really know what it was going to be like in the beginning, thought it would be shorter, but in the end it became quite detailed. It's 143 pages long, but there is a 4-page executive summary if you want to take a look at that. There's an infographic and there's other outputs coming that Timea will also speak to. So the purpose of the webinar today is to really try to give you an overview if you don't have, an extra few hours to go through all 143 pages of that document. But overall, the process was, I would say, exhausting and exhilarating. So now I will go into, did I miss a slide there? Oh, no, okay. I will go into what is in these guidelines. So what are the challenges that are being faced around COVID-19 when it comes to data sharing? What is it that we needed to address? So one thing is the critical need for rapid data sharing. Now, sharing research data in ongoing research, it's always important that it's timely, but in light of the pandemic and how quickly things were changing and how important it is to have an understanding of it across the different areas, the need to share rapidly was really enhanced, I think, in this moment. And there's been a massive, really massive rapid research response all over the world to COVID-19, unlike anything that's really been seen before. But of course, the data that comes out of different kinds of research or different jurisdictions can appear in different formats, which creates issues around being able to reuse that data from those different jurisdictions. So interoperability is a key. So really one of the kind of challenges here was a trade-off between sharing data in a very timely way, but trying to share it in a precise and useful way so that it could be reusable. And how do you try to meet that balance? The guidelines are meant to address that. Another major challenge, so these two main challenges kind of shaped the process. There really is a lack of harmonized universal standards and contexts. Anybody working in libraries and archives, data sharing, data stewardship, and in research knows this. But again, because of the pace, what could we do about that? And plus, there aren't always pre-approved sharing agreements. There's archaic information systems that make it difficult to rapidly share data. So these were two of the main challenges being faced. So given those challenges, then what are the objectives of this working group? What have they been? Well, one is to clearly define detailed guidelines on data and software sharing for COVID-19 research. And this is a challenge because universal standards don't exist for all areas. So again, the effort was to find something that had enough adoption and was widely used and considered to be good that it could be recommended for researchers to adopt. We want to help stakeholders maximize the efficiency and follow best practices, and these are stakeholders from research community, but also in governments, those responding to the pandemic. There's a secondary effort to use this as a blueprint, of course, for future emergencies and to maximize the efficiency of the work there as well. But really the focus in this case was on COVID-19. So there's two main sections in each of the areas when you look at the document, and one is recommendations. So I'm on to number 2 on your on the picture on your screen here right now. So recommendations are kind of higher level recommendations for funders, for policymakers to try to maximize timely and quality data and software sharing, and to do what they can to facilitate that. And then number 3, at a more granular level, to address the interests and the practices of researchers, also of policymakers, but of funders, publishers, and providers of data sharing infrastructure, and to create guidelines that they could follow. This was a very collaborative, cross-disciplinary effort and involving a lot of experts. Timea will give you more information on the kind of groups involved, but overall 600 different individuals signed up around the world to be involved in this, and then some were more involved in others. So as I said, we had 4 research areas and 4 cross-cutting themes. And then with each of those, we had the guidelines, which are detailed practical advice, and the recommendations, which are the higher level ones. So when you go through the document, you'll see things divided in those ways. And that was always the intention, but actually trying to normalize that or format things in that way was actually one of the big challenges of working on something so massive like this. So what I'll do now is, I can't go into too much detail about the different research areas. Of course, if you're working in these, I encourage you to look at these guidelines and to get back to us if you have any further feedback. We'll probably be looking at updating these at some time in the future, but taking a pause on that for now. But to just give you a sense of what the different research areas covered. So the clinical medicine area Timely sharing of data from clinical research, including clinical trials, is of the utmost importance, as we can see over these last number of months. And of course, many clinical studies are being performed under enormous time pressures, which may mean that their study design is not always fully optimal. Again, this is this balance between being fast and doing things to best practice as best as possible. So there are compelling reasons to kind of share even preliminary results that could have implications for treatment. But of course, are there dangers around sharing those results if they haven't really been tested? So this is, again, one of the challenges under the enormous time pressure. So what the recommendations and guidelines look to here is to kind of encourage that the data that supports any of the claims were made is made openly available, and how can you do that in an interoperable way to facilitate that work and that kind of reuse of clinical information. On the omics, the second of our research areas, this is really focused on, of course, omics is a number of things, genomics, proteomics, and metabolomics. And that's all I'll say about them, because I don't know heavily about any of those areas, but really it's about understanding the ways in which the SARS-CoV-2 virus causes COVID-19 disease, to understand the biochemical processes that happen at the cellular and subcellular level. And again, massive kind of research, very detailed work, and how do we share that? So there's many different research groups around the world working in this area, and really a major determinant of the rate of progress is the speed at which the data from one study or many studies are shared with other ones. So omics addresses things like data formats and standards to facilitate that kind of sharing. Next, in terms of research areas, is epidemiology. And of course, understanding the epidemiology of COVID-19 is crucial to inform public health policies, to decrease infection rates, to minimize deaths, to put decisions or to make decisions and implement them at the public level to help manage the progress of this disease. And I would say this is the area that those of us not working in research in the labs or in a clinical setting on COVID-19 might know the most about, because this is about this also addresses sort of public measures that are taken to understand that spread. There's no standards, again, internationally, or a coordinated system for documenting, collecting, and disseminating COVID-19 related data, but there are existing standards for different areas. So making those available and trying to find the pathways between them was the focus of this as well. So you start to see that even in the different research areas, there may be very particular solutions, but a lot of the challenges are similar. Finally, in the social sciences, which was the fourth of our kind of focused research area, social scientists are collecting new information in terms of what's happening socially with the pandemic, but also reusing existing data from other sources, including online data, social media, that sort of thing, to conduct research that can help, again, inform policymakers about social and economic impacts of COVID-19. And this work is also being done to help assess the success of measures that are implemented to try and mitigate the effects of the pandemic. And much of this kind of research involves observational methods that produce very unique data, not things that can necessarily be recreated in the future, because they're time specific when they occur and to a particular population. So it is important that the most we can do to make this data reusable and understandable and contextualized, so the context in which it was created or understood can have meaning beyond that as well for other areas of the pandemic is very important. So the social sciences part delves into things that you should do in advance of dealing with human subjects as well, consent procedures, licenses around data acquisition and that kind of thing, so that this data can then be shared going forward. So that is a really brief taste of the kinds of things that are addressed in the 4 research areas in the recommendations and guidelines. I'll just give you a very brief visual view, so a visual kind of snapshot of what some of these things look like. So if we look at, I've pulled a page from the omics part. So this is from one section in omics. guidelines for host genomics data. And so if you look at this page, you can see that it's giving very specific guidance on which particular data standards you should use. And then there's also sections on which kinds of repositories you should use, and so on. I don't expect you to read that right here, but that gives a snapshot of what kind of thing you'll see. So in addition to those 4 research areas, there were also these 4 what we call cross-cutting themes, and these are areas that really affect broadly the work that's being done. One of those is community participation. You're going to get a slightly deeper dive into that by Timea, because she was the moderator for that group. This is getting others involved, contact tracing, all the sorts of things that happen at a community-wide basis. We also had a cross-cutting theme around Indigenous data, and really emphasized the use of the care principles, so that sovereignty of data is held by the communities that produce it. And I think this is a very important aspect. Very happy that the group that put together the care principles, that a number of them are involved in this aspect. So I guess one thing that's interesting is when you look at these guidelines and recommendations, you're going to see a lot of technical things about COVID-19, but then there's a lot of social elements as well about how we go about doing this research, and what are the kinds of ethical considerations, and what sorts of populations are we studying, and who's being excluded. So it's quite a broad basis here. Research software, which cuts across as well, is another area. It's not just about data sharing, but there's a tremendous amount of software that is used to analyze that data, to produce it, to do the work. And in fact, that needs also to be preserved and shared and made available, so that the data can be understood, and so that the findings can be possibly replicated. So that's it. And then the final cross-cutting theme is legal and ethical considerations. Now, this arose in all of the different research areas, but we decided that it would be useful to have one section that looks quite deeply at the kinds of considerations that should be made when conducting research and when collecting and sharing data. And I'll just give an example of that one from the document itself. So there's lots of different sections under legal and ethical, and the team that worked on this, which included lawyers, solicitors, for example, working in these areas, also looked across the entire document to make sure that there was alignment on the kinds of advice that was given, that it had any kind of legal or ethical implication. So here is just an example of one section, and this one is on consent and how to handle consent and in proper ways to make that sharing useful. And I'm almost done my part. Check my time here to pass on to Timea. So we had these, as I said, 4 different research areas and the 4 cross-cutting themes, but then it became quite clear as the weeks went on and different drafts were released that there were a number of key recommendations that were being made practically by all of the groups, or by most of them. And now some of those have remained in the sections. So when if you ever do sit down and read this entire document, you will see that there is some repetition. You may get one group talking about how data, let's just use a DRI example, should be deposited in a trustworthy data repository. In fact, all of them say that, I think, at some point. So you'll see some of that repetition, but that's because it was important to emphasize the different ways that can be applied depending on what research area we're talking about. But what we did do, and this was kind of one of the core or the heavier functions of the editorial team that I was chairing, was to kind of regularly comb through all of the different recommendations and guidelines that were being created by the groups to see what similarities were emerging, what were some of the overarching or foundational recommendations that we could make. And what you'll see in these is that they're really all focused on fundamentals of data sharing. So while there are challenges that are specific to the different research areas, and different data communities, different research communities have different practices about how they conduct their research and then enable the sharing of the outputs of that research, the fundamental issues are really quite common across those. So I'll just pull a few of these out. One of the really key ones was that there needs to be better coordination globally of cross-jurisdictional efforts to foster open science. Now that's a condensed statement in terms of a recommendation, but the urgency of that kept appearing over and over again. The blockages that researchers would face because they couldn't get data from a different jurisdiction, sometimes within their own country, internal jurisdictions, or the ability to be able to use things that came out of a slightly different research area, but are still fundamental as an input to research. These things occurred over and over again. So this is one of the kind of key recommendations that appeared in the section 2 as it stands in the output. And there's a lot of other things linked to that, right? You can't just create those across jurisdictional coordination. That's created through a number of different elements over time. And it's also created by changes that happen within the research, not the research community, but the way that research is practiced within institutions and how it relates to the kind of work that researchers are doing. So we need to incentivize the early publication and release of data and software. It shouldn't be a secondary thought. And if anything has shown the importance of that, it's this pandemic, the importance of being able to get your hands on that data. But it's work. It is work to share data. It's work to share software and to provide the context required to make it useful. And so that work has to be supported. It has to be funded. It has to be incentivized as a key element of a researcher's career. So these are open science things. If you follow open science, you'll know that this is being discussed in many different kinds of ways, and it is being discussed globally as well. So that's great. But I don't know about you, reading through just different news sites during this pandemic, it seems to me like data and data sharing has finally kind of like hit the press. People are more aware of why that matters. So there's a number of other things behind this. You need IT infrastructure that can be scaled and data systems, and you need skilled people. That's number 3. Number 4, the importance of fair data. So this is a movement that's been happening for some time. Data that is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Hands down, one of the key things that was brought up by everyone working on this, not everyone, but all of the different groups working on these guidelines. FAIR, I think, provides a ready method that is being constantly developed for implementing the types of things that are necessary to share data. So if there's one key thing I'd like to pull out of this, I'm involved in different things around FAIR myself, disclosure, but I do think that is really fundamental because it provides a framework for the kinds of things that need to happen, which includes using data management plans, which is number 5 there. Number 6, which is metadata standards, persistent identifiers, documenting the kind of work that you do, depositing in trustworthy data repositories, and so on. I think I've got up to number 9 on that list. But the rest of them there in terms of key recommendations include balancing ethics and privacy, right? There shouldn't be any pulling back on the ethical considerations of how this work is done. And so privacy should be a consideration, of an utmost consideration. But if you're trying to share things rapidly with enough detail, what are the kinds of walls that you come up against there as well? And yeah, I think I won't go into any more detail on the rest of those. And just let me check. I think this is my last slide here. Yes. So I just want to thank the team at Canary and Research Data Canada because they created this infographic that we just showed you in pieces here on the slides. There'll be links to all of these towards the end that you can follow if you ever wanted to download that and stick it up on the wall in your in wherever you work. So thank you for that. I will now send it over to Timea. I think we can change presenter.
I'll make
here.
myself, yes, I'll make myself presenter. Yes, you should be able to see the slides. And there you go. So as Natalie mentioned, I was one of the people who worked on the community participation subgroup. And we thought that today it was also very important to speak to you about the community aspect and about the collaboration aspect of this exceptional exercise. As she mentioned, as Natalie mentioned, there were around 600 RDA members, including newcomers who have registered for the various subgroups. And 1/4 of those have been active contributors to the outcomes of the working group. That is a considerable amount of weekly webinars, of calls, of reiterations, writing sprints, and whatever other type of exercise they have sort of engaged in order to produce the report and other outcomes in this very short time frame. And a very interesting aspect of that, which makes RDA such an important forum, was that everything was done following the RDA guiding principles of openness, consensus, balance, harmonization, the nonprofit and neutral aspect, and also the very important community-driven aspect. So let's see if the slides go on. Yeah. So we thought that in order to highlight this, it would be very useful for us to also go into a specific example, and we've chosen that of the community participation subgroup. So this was, as Natalie mentioned, one of the subgroups, and it generated one of what we call the cross-cutting theme, which has looked into the various how communities come together, data sharing aspects, and how this has been addressed, and how the emergency and the context has been addressed from that point of view. We had a very specific approach to addressing this, and that was via use cases. So we've looked into 2 specific use cases. One of them was the community-generated data case via app development, and the data challenges that are relative to participatory disaster response strategies. So it was very interesting because our group brought together roughly 120 members, and in order to narrow down the very diverse topics that relate to community participation and how data sharing works in this context, we actually had several brainstorming sessions. We had several writing sprints, and we've also used the survey to try to narrow down the use cases that we would try to address. This was important because it also highlighted the interest that has come from the community and where the actual expertise lies. So that was an interesting factor to consider. The group has generated, like the other subgroups as well, 2 types of policy recommendations, which revolved around transparency, the need for community participation, and data governance, encouraging inclusiveness across the various research aspects and research activities, and the need for an incremental and multidisciplinary approach, ethics and privacy, which has been, as Natalie mentioned, a cross-cutting theme across all the various components of the report. We've also generated guidelines for researchers, and in this case, we've also tried to concentrate on the idea of the teams, of the fact that in this need for a very timely response to the context that we're living in, not only researchers but other types of practitioners and professionals have come together to address this emergency state. So that it was very important for us to consider that multidisciplinary and diversity in the approach. And this it focused specifically on data collection and data stewardship. The cross-cutting theme generated a set of key recommendations. Natalie pointed out a few of those, so I'm not gonna go into too much detail. But just to let you know, obviously, our approach has been focused on certain aspects related to community participation, but we realized that it was sort of different in very interesting ways from the approach that was adopted by the other subgroups, and it made us understand that going back to the overall working group and the overall approach of this exercise, that people will be using when 600 people come together and they're interested in a topic and in a similar activity, they will be using the report and the outcomes in different ways across different disciplines, organizational structures, etc. So we realized that we need additional tools to help navigate the report. Thus, there have been a set of additional outputs to support the report. One of them is the Zotero Library that is available. You see there we have a link on the RDA website where you can find links, where you can find pathways to these different tools that have come out of the work of this group and are supporting the report itself. So we have a Zotero Library, we have the infographic that Natalie has also shared, and in progress now, the group is working on a data stewardship wizard, which is a decision making tool. We are currently developing a knowledge model of the guidelines and recommendations, which will be offering tailored pathways for the different stakeholders that might be interested in adopting the recommendation. So you can see here a screenshot of how the actual tool is going to be made available. And another interesting aspect is that we'll try to make this tool available so that it will be customizable to different legal jurisdictions, because that has been one of the key recommendations and observations that have come out of the work of the different subgroups. We hope that this will also lead up to a mind mapping tool that would connect the different concepts that have come up and how these run across the various sections of the report. Additional ongoing work and future steps that we wanted to highlight with you regard several journal articles that are currently being worked on, and we are heavily involved on one that is actually focusing on the community participation aspect. So we're going to try to look into what made all these different contributors come together and engage, how this non-hierarchical structure and this community of volunteers has managed to reach a consensus and pull out this report with a very aggressive timeline, as I was saying, how bringing together the various expertise from different domains was managed, how different approaches and the overall disciplinary effort has come together. We'll also try to look into very specific aspects that relate to common use of vocabularies, which is quite basic, but it's very important. So, and all of this happening with the background of living through a pandemic, which obviously all of us have experienced. In addition to that, there are several RDA groups that are being set up, and a few plenary 16 sessions that are going to be organized. Hopefully, one also on the community participation, which will bring out a little bit more the citizen science aspect. We are further looking into other stakeholder support and are interested in how this has been adopted across, as I mentioned, various organizations, domains, by various people in their roles, and how this can be further made value of in the future. All of these links and a lot more information is available on the RDA website. There we have a value of RDA for COVID-19 data sharing page, and there's the full background of the work of this group, in addition to the various outputs, the resources that I've mentioned, some of the joint statements that have helped show the stakeholder support, and also the additional ramifications of the outputs of this work, and future events and other things that will be coming up related to this. So keep an eye out for that section. And this would be it. Again, we hope we're sharing a couple of contact details for the Research Data Alliance. As you know, this is a forum that is available for all, and hopefully it will draw upon this experience, and it will be a great place to come together for future similar activities. Yes, this would be a close up of our presentation. I'll try to go back to the value of RDA for COVID page, and I think we can open up the section for questions. Natalie, if you would like to turn on your camera as well, I'll try to open up our question box. I don't know if you can.
I'm back. I have them there. Yeah, so Mark Brunel has asked, how did you deal with privacy issues and legal limitations when wanting to share and reuse data rapidly? Do the recommendations go into that aspect as well? Challenging question. I won't go over what the recommendations are in this call, but what I can say is yes, it does look at those issues. And there's no kind of simple solution to that. There's certainly no recommendation that, oh, well, just forget about privacy, it's really important, go ahead and share them. So the recommendations tend to go in the direction of what can you do in advance to try to make that data sharing more efficient and faster when the time comes. So what are some of the things you can take into consideration when you're designing your study and getting participants involved and that kind of thing. But then there are recommendations around how, say, policymakers could policymakers or institutions could try to fast track ethical approval if the study has to do with COVID-19. So what are some of the ways that we could take the existing systems, which may be too heavy, and try to prioritize or shape things in the direction that would help with that? So that's a kind of summary response to it. But if you look in particular at the legal and ethical section, and then probably also under clinical, you'll find more detailed responses to that.
If I may add to that, I think a very interesting approach to this has come from obviously from the ethical and legal subgroup, but they've tried to do a hierarchy of obligations, which I think is extremely useful, not only for researchers and for people working on data sharing issues, but also for policymakers who might try to address these while being considerate of the different jurisdictions and different approaches to whatever it is the important level of legal and ethical considerations that need to be taken into included in the work that they're doing. So let's see. I apologize if the slides were not we're caught on the side. It must be my wide screen. That I'm hoping that it wasn't a big issue. Okay. Do we have any other questions? Again, you can use the question panel if you would like to.
That was the only question that came in so far. We'll wait a minute to see if anybody types others, but we will share these slides. So yeah, it's just a tiny bit of the slide that's cut off, and we did test it all, but you know, here you go. Technology issues. Oh. Yeah. This is a good question, and I kind of would rather someone else answer it. Fiona Brennan says, any advice on how best to promote this information with the relevant researchers? This is a really good question, and it kind of comes up, I think, when talking about open science practices or open research practices in general a lot. You have some different research domains or some people within research domains or some institutions who are kind of aware and really get on board with data sharing and look up how to do it. And then others aren't as involved in that practice. And then there's the spectrum of everything in between. You know, institutionally, I guess, is one way to go about it. I'm just going to try to think of suggestions here off the top of my head. But you know, in a lot of universities, if you're looking at research that's conducted within a university environment, often the library is involved, or there'll be involved in helping researchers to steward their data and give recommendations on that. So that's one way, is to sort of seek advice there. And then, you know, going through, I guess, professional associations is another way. We're happy and really would be great for anyone to share these guidelines with their research communities in any way that they can. So, you know, there was a real mix of individuals involved in the working group. There were quite a few that are really experts in data sharing, and then there were experts in the different areas of research that are being conducted on COVID-19. And it was the coming together of those two that worked. So those that are involved and the networks they're involved in, this information is being disseminated into. Yeah, it's a matter of sharing as broadly as possible. There are other initiatives underway. So Timea mentioned some of the journal papers, which the idea there is that it will kind of hit different communities. We've been talking to the OECD about kind of disseminating through them. And so there is a policy paper that's under consideration, or a policy briefing that's under consideration with the OECD based on this work. But it remains to be seen how that's best going to be channeled out through them as well. So yeah, those are just, I guess, a few ways into it. Timea, you may have more to add here with your science communications background.
Yeah. Well, not only that, in this specific case, since the report has addressed the different domains and subjects, we realized that there were recommendations, obviously, across the various sections. So that's why we're currently working on a data stewardship wizard tool. I've touched upon it briefly, and I've put back the slide on. This is actually designed to provide these pathways, and one of them is for the researchers. So it goes through the various recommendations and the information that is included in the report, and pulls out the specific points that are for researchers, policymakers, funders. So in this case, I think that well, the guidelines and the mind map for the researchers would be very useful, because it's based on a very easy to use decision tree tool that would allow them to find the right things to answer whatever issues they might have regarding data sharing in this specific case. So hopefully this will be a good way to promote the information with the researchers.
Do you want to go ahead, Timea?
Yes, if we can continue. I see that there are a few more questions that have come in. so this is a fair one. Are there specific recommendations on creating fair data points? And I think it comes from Mark, and he also provides an additional point on that. I mean, in the sense that everybody talks about fair data points, but nobody says that what these are, what these specifically are. So do you want to take that?
Sure,
on?
yeah. Yes, there are specific recommendations on creating fair data in this. So fair data, the findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable is a kind of sort of umbrella term to describe things. And then if you look at the fair data principles, you can see that there are more specific recommendations in those, but they all still look rather high level. But some of the things that are really key to fair is like one of the fundamental elements of creating a fair digital object, which is a kind of organizing metaphor that we often refer to, is to make sure that you use persistent identifiers. Okay, so that's a simple one. So how persistent identifiers can be used, it is addressed in here, but also another really important aspect to all aspects of FAIR is the inclusion of metadata that provides a way for others looking at that data set to make sense of it, right? So if you just take a spreadsheet that's got 100,000 different lines of collected data on it and put it up on the internet so anybody can look at it, it's not very useful, right? Because what is this thing we're looking at it? How do we understand it? What does it mean? All of that information should be included in the metadata. So the kinds of standards that should be used for different research areas are addressed when those are things that have a relatively high level of consensus around them. There's recommendations, sharing your data. Well, how do you share your data? For FAIR, the recommendation is definitely to use trustworthy data repositories that have been certified, and the best ones that you can use are ones that are widely adopted by your particular research community. So the guidelines will name what those ones are, depending on the research area. So that's just a couple of examples. So there definitely are very specific recommendations around, I guess, verifying your data within the guidelines and recommendations, but they're spread throughout the different research areas, depending on what the topic is and what was seen as the most urgent thing to address by those different researchers. There isn't a kind of mapping for each thing in there, but those kinds of activities are happening in other places. So.
Yeah, related to that, the metadata discussion has come up very often in the community participation discussions as well, and something that was very often mentioned was the need to include in the metadata all the references as possible, as many references as possible to how the data has been collected, and also to the technology that has been used. So I think that's one of the aspects that was quite often mentioned, and as a requirement also to make data more fair was that as well. Okay, I think we have another question from Paul. What are the aspects which were not already under study before the epidemic? So what are maybe things that have come up as we realized as we went along in this activity that were probably not as relevant or as visible before the pandemic? Should I? Maybe I can try.
Take a start. I can add something if.
So.
Yeah.
So citizen, I'll speak again from the community participation point of view. We before this pandemic, there was a broad discussion about citizen science and about the participation of the general public to the scientific process and to the scientific exercises. And now this, especially through the app development efforts that have gone on during the pandemic, has become even more obvious, and all the issues that are related to collecting data from the general public have been even more visible. and issues related to data governance in this case, and also the transparency around similar things that, like the national apps for contact tracing and how these are being developed, what happens to the data, who's the owner, obviously, how relevant they are. Do we have the structures in place to ensure that the community is safe, and if in case of a positive response to the tracking app, do we have the structures in place to support the people that receive such messages? So these all these different aspects have I think been more obvious in this conversation. I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
No, I mean, I think you've done a really good job at touching on some of the really key important points. You know, we've never seen a pandemic, obviously, of this scale before in our lifetimes, and also there's so many things we could talk about here, like in terms of globalization and how quickly things are spreading across borders. So if a virus is spreading across borders, then our need to address that, we need data to go across borders as well, right? There's no potential silo here for the way that research is conducted, because it's got such a broad impact. So, you know, how to share data, some of the scientific kinds of study that were happening before, these things were in existence, but the way that they've come together under this pandemic, the issues that have been brought out by the way that this has developed and the way that it's spread, and the kinds of technologies that are available to us now that may not have been in the past, I think that's definitely something that would be considered new in this study, and how to address them under the kinds of time pressure that we're dealing with. There's talk of vaccines all the time, and then we also hear talk of how unlikely it is we're going to have a vaccine anytime soon. Just the sense that we could be talking about that now shows the kind of urgency or the expectations from the public. So we're in a bit of a different environment. You know, open science has been very well developed over the last number of years, but it still has very far to go in terms of actual implementation. I see this as such a huge opportunity now, because I think people get it in a sense. And I think policymakers and governments are understanding really fundamentally how important it is. It's not just a concept of, oh yeah, you should share your data so others can use it. You should share your data so others can build on it, and fewer people are going to die tomorrow. Like it's really that serious. I don't know if that fully answers it, but it was dramatic. We're almost out of time.
We do have another.
Sorry.
Yes. What aspect of the recommendations would you say is of the highest priority?
Might have to send you back to take a look at them. We do have an executive summary that kind of pulls out key recommendations, but I'll be honest, the process of that was really tough, because a lot of these things are interdependent, right? So if the fundamental thing is share your data in a fair way as soon as possible, following all the kind of ethical and privacy considerations and the inclusivity of different communities and all of that, that's a high level, or not a high level, but that's a high priority recommendation. But it's composed of a number of different components. So it's not an easy thing to answer, because I think different areas of the kind of research ecosystem, for lack of a better term, have different things they need to do, and they may seem dependent on one another, but everyone has to start taking baby steps at the same time, really, to get towards it. So you can look at, we have the key recommendations that are in that infographic. Prioritizing is tough, because it comes from a bunch of different perspectives.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I think an important aspect or a priority that has come up again in various discussions has been the need for this balance between the timeliness of the response and the need to consider privacy and community safety issues. Also the need to bridge the communities, because we realized how different the various approaches have been across the various domains and subgroups. So we need structures that would allow people to come together, and a good way to balance the expertise and make the most of the time that we have available and the resources.
Yeah, I'm just trying to reflect on it a bit more. It's a really good question. I guess one thing I might say is data can't be treated as a secondary, less important output. Really, any research design or any funders that are funding research or policymakers that are looking for particular outcomes need to ensure that the fundamental importance of sharing data, making it openly available, and making it openly available in a quality way that others can reuse, and again, FAIR is the short form for that, is really key, and has to be kind of put up on the agenda, whether it's through institutions recognizing the value of that when it comes to the work that their staff and their faculty conduct, and providing kind of incentives and rewards for that kind of work, or if it's very hardline policies that say you're not getting any money unless you do this, and we're going to follow up and make sure that you share it. So there's lots of different ways to approach it, but yeah, the highest priority is to from the beginning treat your data collection behaviors and outputs as of very high importance. That's what I would say. We have 1 minute left, and there's one last question.
Yes. If we have a timeline for when the wizard will be made available, we hope in the next month. It might not be a full release, but at least a few of the sections of the pathways will be made available. But keep an eye out on the Value for RDA page. That's where we will publish, and the RDA will be sending out. The RDA Secretariat will be sending out more information on that. So thank you. Okay.
Yeah.
I think we're done with the questions. Thank you all for joining us. We're gonna make available. We're gonna both make the slides available as well as the video recording on the RDA website, and we hope to see you soon for another webinar under the RDA Ireland series. Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining.